All right, so with lab, we talked about the anatomy of the central nervous system. And so we will skip over a lot of those slides in this presentation since we've already discussed that. And so now that we know the different parts, the cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, brainstem, and so remember, cerebrum's this large area. The main part of what we think about is the brain. Diencephalon is in the center of the brain. Brainstem is what comes out and then turns into the spinal cord down here. And then our baby brain is our cerebellum back under the occipital lobe. And so here are the basic generalized functions of each of these areas. And so for your possible exam questions, at least if you give me this, it'll get you partial credit, but this would not be enough to get full credit for that possible exam question. But the cerebrum is where we have all of our higher mental functions, interpretation of our sensory stimuli, and plans and initiates movement. So that integration that we talked about back in chapter 11. With the diencephalon, we integrate and relay information. That thalamus is the gatekeeper from the peripheral up into the central nervous system, maintains our homeostasis. So that is with our hypothalamus and regulates those biological rhythms also. Cerebellum kind of fine tunes, and so it monitors and coordinates our movement. And then the brainstem is our base. This is what almost all living organisms, a lot of living organisms have within the animal kingdom. And so the brainstem does those basic functions such as heartbeat, breathing. So maintains the homeostasis, controls reflexes, integrates and relays information into and out of the central nervous system. We've talked about how the white matter is our myelinated axons, whereas the gray matter are the axonal cell bodies and the unmyelinated. And then it kind of reverses in our spinal cord. So in the brain, the white matter is in the center with the gray matter out towards the outer cortex and in towards here, whereas it's reversed in our spinal cord with the white matter on the outside with the spinal gray matter in the center in the shape of a butterfly. The sulcus are the rays, the gyri. The sulcus are the valleys, the gyres are the raised areas when you have very deep fissures or deep grooves. Those are your fissures, and you have one large longitudinal fissure separating the left and right cerebral cortexes. This also gives more surface area for the brain and allows it to fit into our skulls. Here are all the different regions of the brain, and again, this is covered in lab. And the lobes, same as our skull, that overlies the different areas of the brain, and the insula in the middle. Now here is the functions of our brain. And so we have a primary somatosensory, so this is where all of our sensory information comes in. Then it is integrated, and our output is through this primary motor cortex. We have our frontal eye field. Here is Broca's. This is involved with speech and forming speech and interpretation of speech, along with the Wernicke's area back here. Primary auditory cortex. Our primary visual cortex is back here in the occipital lobe. So all of our functioning spread throughout the brain. And here you can see our motor, sensory, and association areas of the cerebral cortex and their functions. You by no means have to know all of these, but this is a table that summarizes them. All right, so remember when we talked about how nuclei, when you hear nuclei, that is where we have clusters of neuronal cell bodies in the central nervous system. When we're out in the peripheral nervous system, they are called ganglia. And so our clusters, our three main clusters of our neuronal cell bodies within the cerebrum are our caudate nuclei of Putnam and the globus pallidus. And here you can see, do you notice when we talked about our ventricles and the way that the cerebral spinal fluid flows around the brain, these look like those lateral horns of the ventricles. So these are our lateral ventricles. And surrounding the thalamus, so the globus pallidus, here kind of in the same area as the thalamus. So you have all these nuclei. And why would that mean? That's why you have the cerebral spinal fluid flowing near these guys, because that's how they get their oxygen, that's how they get their nutrients, that's how they get rid of their waste and their carbon dioxide. So notice how these nuclei are kind of the same shape as our ventricle systems, because that's how they're getting their flow and their energy and their oxygen to maintain their metabolic functions. And you don't have to really know much about these. These are just pointing out just for your information to see where we have those clusterings of nuclei, those clusterings of nuclear cell bodies. And then from those clusterings of nuclear cell bodies, we have our axons going out. And so these are our association fibers. And so that's how we connect the different lobes, different hemispheres, different areas of the brain. So our commisual fibers are going to connect your left and right hemispheres. And so these are the blue fibers here. The projection fibers connect the cerebral cortex. And so the connection fibers are going to be the green ones, or I'm sorry, the red ones, that are going to go from the upper parts, the brain, the central nervous system, down through the brainstem and into the spinal cord. And then our association fibers are what are going to stay within a single hemisphere and connect the gray matter of those hemispheres within the hemisphere. And so these are the green association fibers, and you can see how they run in a parasagittal section here. And so this is how our action potentials are going to travel through the central nervous system from one fiber to the next to move around to where they need to go and to go back out. So come in sensory, leave out motor. And so here you can see an action potential originates in one of the gray matter regions of the brain. Remember, gray matter is where our neuron cell bodies, so that axon hillock gets to threshold, fires an action potential. Then it goes through, travels through another area of the gray matter by our projection fibers. Then an association fiber is going to carry it through that same, not lobe, but hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. And then if we need to go over to the other hemisphere, then we're going to use the commisual fibers to move from one cerebral hemisphere to the other. And these are all synapses. So the action potential moves via synaptic cleft from here to here and from here to here until it reaches its destination. And so that's how an action potential gets moved around. Associated with the central nervous system is also our limbic system. And we have several major areas in the limbic system. The limbic lobe is associated structures to form a ring of the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere. So here's our limbic lobe. Again, notice it kind of looks like those lateral horns of our ventricles. There's the fornix. You labeled the fornix. You'll label the fornix in the brain. And then the hippocampus is in the temporal lobe. And so here is the hippocampus down here off of the darker orange area. And this is involved with memory and learning. So the limbic system, along with the nuclei, work to function for the central nervous system. And then last but not least, this little pink area at the very end is called the amygdala. And it is involved in behavior and emotion, especially fear. So the amygdala, that's what amygdala, it always takes me a minute to get it out. The amygdala. And so this is our limbic system that works in coordination in the central nervous system to carry out its functions. And here's a nice little summary of the fornix, the limbic lobe, main functions, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. But there aren't any really possible short answer questions on that. Most of that would appear within your possible multiple choice questions. All right. So that was the cerebellum and its associated structures, and here is the diencephalon. And so the diencephalon made up of the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and subthalamus are what make up our... So here's the thalamus, the egg-shaped, and then right off the thalamus is the hypothalamus. And then we have our subthalamus down here, and the epithalamus coming off the back, associated with the pineal gland. The subthalamus, the mammary body, is in front of that. And coming off of our hypothalamus is an extension of the hypothalamic tissue called the pituitary gland. And these two coordinate our endocrine system, so play a major role in endocrine. And so here you can see both lobes of the thalamus and how they are situated within the cerebellum. And so two egg-shaped regions of gray matter make up 80% of the diencephalon. The third ventricle is found between them. And they have the afferent fibers from many other areas of our nervous system. Remember, I told you the thalamus is our gatekeeper. All of our special senses actually run through the thalamus except for the sense of smell. And that's because those the smell sensory bulbs are above the brainstem, and so they do not travel through the thalamus, but all of our other special senses do relay through the thalamus. We have several nuclei associated with the thalamus also, and again, remember, nuclei are clusterings of the cell body. And so these nuclei are involved in controlling arousal, consciousness, responsiveness, excitability of the cerebral cortex. And as I mentioned before, they receive the input, they're kind of the gatekeepers, and then send it out to the appropriate areas. It is the relay station for the central nervous system. Hypothalamus, and as I mentioned earlier, lots of hormones for the endocrine system. And so it sends most of those hormones down to, or it sends the hormones it makes to the pituitary system, releasing or inhibiting those hormones in the pituitary. The part of the pituitary is an endocrine gland within itself, and it'll stimulate to make additional antibodies, hormones. And so again, hypothalamus, pituitary, big part of the endocrine system. The mammillary bodies that are also towards the front of the diencephalon are involved in memory regulation and behavior. And then the hypothalamus also is our homeostatic regulator, working with body temperature, food, thirst, hunger, all those types of things. They have quite a few functions. Epithalamus, back with the pineal gland, secretes melatonin, which regulates our sleep-wake cycle. And then the subthalamus, together they control with our basal nuclei, control movement. And last but not least, actually this isn't last, this is third, because we still have the brainstem after this, is the cerebellum, or our brain. Our baby brain has the arbor vitae. That is the only structure you really need to know. And remember, the arbor vitae is the white matter in the cerebellum, so that's going to be our myelinated axons. And it coordinates and fine-tunes that motor movement that we have. We do have some nuclei within the cerebellum, so these are where the neuronal cell bodies are associated, and the arbor vitae is where we saw the myelinated axons running out. All right, now last but not least is our brainstem. So the brainstem is the oldest component of the brain. Many animals have the same brainstem or the same functions within the brainstem. The brainstem is divided into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And so we have lots of associated nuclei and areas within the brainstem. So here you can see all of these. You don't have to know any of them, but you can see how there are clustering of neuronal cell bodies and tracks that run through. Remember, groupings of axons within the central nervous system are called tracks, and groupings of neurons within our PNS are what we call nerves. And here's the overall picture of all four main regions and their associated areas with the brain. And here's an actual brain showing all the areas of the cerebellum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and our brainstem. And here you can see how the tracks, the axons, are going to run up and down the brainstem until they reach the spinal cord. And then here's our big picture, tying everything together with our limbic system, our basal nuclei, the brainstem, diencephalon, cerebral or basal nuclei, and our limbic system along with the cerebellum, and how they all work together to keep us who we are and how unique we are as the human species. And there are summary tables giving you more detail, so this should give you everything you need to answer the questions about the functioning of the cerebrum and its associated structures, the diencephalon, how the thalamus does, and hypothalamus here you can see regulates autonomic, regulates sleep-wake, regulates thirst-hunger, body temperature hormones, and controls the secretion from the pituitary. Then our cerebellum, not much to this guy. He just coordinates the voluntary movement and fine-tunes it. And then all the things regulated by our brainstem. These are the midbrain, main functions, pons, and the medulla oblongata. So make sure you get at least these into those possible exam questions that you have for Chapter 12. All right, so this ends the first part of the lecture for Chapter 12, and then I will have a second lecture up to finish up Chapter 12. Have a wonderful day.